I'd like to introduce Rabbi Ed Weinsberg, our Vice President of Programming, who will be introducing our speaker this morning.
Thanks, Al. Appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. I want to tell you from the very outset that Bryan and I have become fast friends over the years. We first met 14 years ago when he came to my synagogue on North Shore of Boston, and we've stayed in touch since. He's written many books in the interim. A couple that we already heard about when he came to us last spring, or has it been longer? I'm losing track, talking about Hitler's Jewish soldiers. He's written another new book called Flamethrower, which I highly recommend to you, about the battles in the Pacific theater of war during World War II, and yet writing a new book, which I will look at the draft just as a participant in his wonderful writing style. And he's a very dynamic speaker, as you all recall and will see and hear today. He's a military historian trained at Yale and Cambridge universities. He is, as he put it, as I recently saw in his newest draft, an ethical humanist and atheist with Jewish roots. Now that's a mouthful, but he's a very considerate, kind individual, and he believes in the doctrine of loving your neighbor as yourself. He has served as a volunteer in the Israeli Defense Forces and has been a board member of the American Jewish Committee and the Dallas Holocaust Museum. And here's Bryan.
Hey, Rabbi, thank you for those kind words. Appreciate it. So good to see you this morning. I was worried that you weren't going to be able to make it. I wish you good health and recovery. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming this morning. Joel, let me know. I have my laptop on my lap. I'm hopefully keeping it steady. I know you're recording it, but if it gets really wobbly or whatnot, I have a desk right next to me that I can put it on and talk into it. But if it's looking good and the video looks like it's going to be all right, then I'll just keep where I am right now.
Okay.
So when I talked to Rabbi several months ago about doing this talk, we talked about kind of giving an overview of the Jewish experience in militaries and honoring especially several of our heroes here in America. And so I've been thinking about just highlighting a few individuals, what they mean for us as Americans, but also for us as military historians, and just kind of talking about the military traditions in Judaism, if you will. And just some of my observations being a military historian, Holocaust historian through the years. So I've been going through, I've never given a talk like this before. And so since Rabbi gave me this mandate, I've been thinking about what I should talk about and been changing things. I did a little homework this morning and changed a few things again. So I'm about as curious and interested as you guys are to hear what I'm about to say. So, you know, when you look at the history of the martial tradition in Judaism, you know, whether this guy really existed or not, he has played large in the Jewish consciousness of a warrior king, King David. And, you know, and the Mashiach, you know, is always talked of the house of David. And we honor him, you know, a man after God's own heart, but we also honor him for being an incredible warrior. And from our mythology, you know, having one of the largest empires in the Middle East and one of the longest dynasties in the ancient world. And so this has played large in our communities for a long time, and, you know, and a lot of the Messiah movements that we've had. According to a couple of historians I've been reading recently, we've had, you know, like the last 2,000 years, like every 60 years, we have a Messiah movement. And they're always claiming the house of David and the warrior and the strength. And when we have the time of the Mashiach, as all of us were raised, you know, every generation has a potential Mashiach. You know, it matters whether we're, or it comes down to whether we're worthy of him or not, whether he's going to reveal himself. But when you look at rabbinic writings and whatnot, when that happens, there's going to be a lot of warfare, a lot of destruction, a lot of fighting. So we have this in our culture, and it's because, you know, Judaism was born out of a very brutal part of the world, with the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Phoenicians and so on, where war was a daily occurrence. It kind of reminds me of a conversation Trotsky had with a young man one day, when the young man was saying war is immoral, we need to ban it, it is a horrible thing, I can't believe you're talking about it. And Trotsky looked at the young man and said, son, you may not be interested in war, but war is very interested in you. And so, we obviously, with the destruction of the Second Temple in the first major Jewish revolt, and then definitely after Bar Kokhba, with the second Jewish revolt in Rome, 132 to 135. Here again, these revolts, a lot of times the men who were leading, Bar Kokhba is the most famous case in 132 to 135, with Rabbi Akiba declaring him actually the new King David, the Mashiach and so on. And of course, they were very wrong when Rabbi Akiba got skinned alive in Caesarea, and of course, Bar Kokhba died in battle. A lot of people were hoping that a lot of people don't realize that there has to be two Messiahs. One dies in battle, and he is usually considered the Messiah of Joseph's line, and then another Messiah comes on the scene, and he's David, and he actually brings about the peace in the new world and brings God down for judgment and so on. So a lot of people were thinking that might happen after Bar Kokhba died in battle, but as we know, it didn't. But yet a lot of these type of figures as well in the first Jewish revolts, and there was this huge kind of push for martial culture, which is interesting because when you look at the Jews of the Roman Empire, they were given a lot of religious freedom. I mean, there was a few nut jobs there, Caligula and Nero and so on, that were trying to force pagan beliefs on us. But, under Caesar Augustus, we were given incredible leniency, and we were actually absolved of all military duties, unlike almost everybody else in the Roman Empire, which caused a lot of attention with the Hellenistic communities that were around our Jewish communities in Palestine. In fact, a lot of times when there was the different uprisings, the Greek communities would kind of rise up and go after us with the Romans, kind of like what we saw in World War II when Germany went into the Baltic states. And all of a sudden you had all these Latvians, Lithuanians joining in the SS, killing us, and in Poland as well, unfortunately. So, as we know, after the first and second Jewish revolt, a lot of us, a lot of the Jewish communities were like, you know what? Rising up against these empires, especially the Roman Empire, isn't a very good thing. And let's just go to study and not really focus a lot on trying to get rid of the Roman Empire and trying to bring on a new age of the Messiah. And so we went really into studying. We didn't have a lot of revolts. Of course, the diaspora started happening, and we started spreading out all over the place. And then we started serving in a lot of the militaries throughout the world. And I'm going to kind of jump forward now, looking at one area where I know an awful lot about, which is German experience, and then also the American experience. So basically, at the revolutionary times, we had a lot of Jews in America, and they were several thousand. And George Washington promised them that they keep separation of church and state, and they wouldn't be persecuted. They helped in a lot of logistic positions with George Washington's militaries and getting food and so on. At the same time, or a little bit before that, Frederick the Great in Germany brought in a lot of the Jews as well. And since they were so good at organization, and many of them were educated, that's something that was wonderful about our community throughout time, that learning how to read and write was always critical. So it made us kind of, in all these militaries that we're in, we were kind of in the higher organizational offices instead of being frontline grunts. And so Frederick the Great used several of the Jews in his lands to help him with his logistics and to provide him cattle and to make sure people were being fed. And he was going on record, without his Jewish population, he would not have been able to, in the 7 Years' War, to have all the incredible feats and victories that he did. You fast forward after Hardenberg and Stein kicked out Napoleon. The one interesting thing that we talked about offline before we came on that's very interesting, and for those of you who want to know how many of us got our names, I encourage you to read the book called The Stigma of Names by Dietz Baring. But Hardenberg and Stein in Germany, after they kicked out Napoleon, they started drafting us into the military. And they started forcing all of us in German lands to take on last names. That's why people said, we're not, Mendel, Ben Joseph or whatnot. They just started becoming, Josephson, or they became Mendelssohn, and so on. Or if they were, like I was mentioning to the gentleman beforehand, if they were tall, their name got to be Gross. If they were short, they were Klein. If they had white hair, silver hair, they were called Weiss or Weissmann. If they had dark hair, they were called Schwarz or Schwarzmann, and so on. But this was also an integration into the society. And one thing I didn't tell the gentleman that this might be very interesting for you guys to know is one of the big reasons why they wanted to put on names to be more German, obviously, but also to have proper documents and tracking to draft people. And if you don't know their names, and if not everybody's on the same page with how names are done, it's very hard to draft people. When their name is changing every generation, you want to focus on the families, know what their names are, where they're born, and so on. So that's something else that was kind of interesting. Then we get to the Civil War in America. Speaking of some of our heroes and veterans, one of my heroes, and a lot of people don't know about him, his name is Abraham Cohen. He was a sergeant major, which these guys are crusty old guys. They've been in the service for 20 or 30 years. So this means Abraham Cohen had probably joined the service, in the 30s and 40s. The records are a little unclear here. But by the time he got to the Civil War, he had definitely 20 years of experience. And he got the Medal of Honor at Petersburg, serving under Joshua Chamberlain, when there was a section of the line, as they were laying siege to Petersburg, that was pushed back. The Confederates infiltrated. They outflanked the Union forces there, and they started to panic. And here this old crusty Jewish sergeant major starts yelling at all these guys, rallies them, starts plugging the holes, and then does a counteroffensive and throws the rebels back. Now, one thing in military history that is horrible is when you start to run and panic and leave, that's when you lose most of your guys. You got to keep them focused. You got to keep them together. So Abraham Cohen was brilliant with what he did, was a hero, and he was, very Jewish and very American and just a great Yankee at this time. On the other side of the world, you have the wars against Denmark, the wars against Austria, and then, of course, the Franco-Prussian War, the war against France that Germany is conducting under Bismarck. These wars, you have huge, I always find this fascinating. At Franco-Prussian War, outside of Verdun, during Yom Kippur, you had 3,000 German soldiers who basically were celebrating in the field Yom Kippur. On the opposite lines in France, the French guys, there was like 1,000 guys on the other side doing the same thing. So the sad thing about this is with the diaspora, as we're spreading out and we're being very loyal citizens, we're proving our worth in each country we go to by being part of the culture, contributing to the culture, serving in the militaries, a lot of times being drafted, which many of us wanted to be drafted during this time in America, as well as in, Prussia and France and these other countries, because it was a sign that we were equal, and unfortunately, as many of you have learned throughout the years, the Catholic Church and then also the Protestant Church with Luther there was such a strong, preachment about anti-Semitism, that we're guilty of deicide in perpetuity, and killing Christ killers. One reason a lot of people don't know this, even in Jewish circles, when I give lectures, is, why are we in banking? Why were we so good in banking? Well, the Catholic Church read in, the Torah that you should not practice lending, or you were going to go to hell, was one of their preachments. But then they said, well, hey, since Jews are already going to hell, we'll let them do the banking. But as being the lenders and the collectors and so on did not always endear us to the populations we were at. But that's one reason why we have such a tradition of banking. And also a lot of the rulers in the different countries respected our ability to handle money, our ability to set up financial institutions, our ability to do lending and so on. And so on one side, it helped us bring us into these societies and be incredible contributors to society. But on the other side, it created a lot of jealousy and so on, because some of the wealthiest families came into a lot of wealth by doing this, and they were Jewish families, and the majority didn't like looking at the minority getting more social status. An interesting little side note here: in Germany at this time, with the Napoleonic Wars, you had all these people, especially under Frederick the Great. So basically from the 1750s until 1814, 1850, you had all these men that one way to reward them for their battle deeds was to give them title deeds to lands all over the place. And when you did that to these men, you gave them the aristocratic names. So, Bismarck would become von Bismarck. Goblenz would become von der Goblenz. So whenever you see a V-O-N, very different than the Dutch V-A-N, when you see a V-O-N, that is aristocratic. And that was the christening that Frederick the Great and other, kings of Prussia and so on in Bavaria and all over German lands would do to reward these men. Well, when you get into after the Napoleonic Wars, and you look at the economic structure of Europe at this time, a lot of their land holdings were not economically viable. They could not sustain these huge estates, these castles that they had, and so on. So what was a new trend that you see in the 1800s for basically 100 years is quite often you would have these very high level aristocratic military families marrying into Jewish families. The Jewish family, by giving a daughter to one of these families, would get the status with the high level name, von Stauffenberg, von Manstein, all these, von Schonhorst, and all these incredible names, von Schlieffen, and so. And the aristocratic families now would have the money to support their estates. So you have a huge blend of this military culture, military leaders in Germany marrying into Jewish families, primarily in these first couple levels with their daughters, then having these children who then are raised in Prussian military schools. So by the time you get to World War I with Germany, you have everybody and their dog serving in the military and very proud. You had 100,000 Jews who served in the German military in World War I. 12,000 of them died. Leo Beck, of incredible fame, Reform rabbi who went with his people to Theresienstadt, a brilliant guy. He was a chaplain in World War I. He was so brave in combat, he got the Iron Cross. A lot of people don't know that about his background. But Austria is even more of a dramatic example of this culture of bringing in a lot of men who were of Jewish descent, and they were drafted, and they're very patriotic. You had 300,000 Jews who served in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in World War I. 25,000 died. Now, let me put this into context. These 30,000 Jews who died for Austria and Germany in World War II are more Jews than all the Israeli military deaths to date. We're at about, I think, 27,000 Jews who have died in combat in the Israeli wars that we've had since 1948. So this military tradition was very strong in Germany, in Europe at this time, because you had a lot of Jews in the French military as well, and the Russian military. They forced us to serve for 25 years. An interesting little side note here about the Austrian military. One of the most brilliant men to serve in the Austrian military was a guy by the name, he was Lieutenant General Field Marshal. They had these weird ranks in Austria. Von Friedlander. He was a quote-unquote half Jew, but married to a full Jew. And he was responsible for all logistics in World War I for Austria. Brilliant. When you look at the campaign with Italy and in those mountain Alps, if you didn't have proper logistics, that whole front broke down. And he was responsible for basically protecting Austria, Hungarian Empire, in the soft belly with Italy, and was a brilliant, brilliant man. Well, fast forward in World War II, he refused to divorce his Jewish wife. He was labeled a full Jew as a result. It's called Geltungsjude. And both he and his wife were eventually, they were deported to Theresienstadt and then later on to Auschwitz. And it's just a sad testament of what happened to a lot of these men who served very bravely. I mean, there's countless stories of all these World War I veterans, when it was their time to be deported, would show up to their deportation stations in their uniform with their iron crosses, showing just the confusion that was going on about what is a citizen, what is service, what is a German. And in World War I mean, you have incredible warriors. One guy by the name of Wilhelm Frankel. A lot of these Jews are being named after famous German men. So many guys are named Otto, for Otto von Bismarck, and Wilhelm for the Kaiser, and so on. Wilhelm Frankel was a well-known fighter ace. He died in combat, but he got the Medal of Honor for Germany, the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, if you will. You also had a guy that was a high-ranking officer, and he was also a fighter ace named Fritz Beckmann. And he flew an airplane with a swastika on it to show his German pride. The swastika was a symbol of Germanness in World War I. We all know about stormtroopers from Star Wars, but where does this real term come from? Well, it comes from a guy by the name of Willy War. And in World War I, Willy War was a brilliant man who, and Joel, how do I get, I keep on having different people coming on and off as the main, picture in my screen. How do I just have me or Rabbi Weinsberg, why not just stay on the screen? Do you know?
What happened was I was muting people who weren't unmuted, and it momentarily switched to them, but it goes back to you.
Oh, okay, great. Hey, thanks. So getting back to Willy War, he was brilliant in the sense that he realized that having infantry units, and he's Jewish, having infantry units, having machine gun units, having mortar units separated instead of combined was idiotic when he went into battle, because you never knew what you were going to meet up on the fronts with the French where he was fighting. So he started saying, hey, we got to do combined arms. Now, this seems so natural now. I was a Marine Corps officer, and then I was in the Israeli military. Having your machine guns and mortars and rifles and bazookas all in one unit, and everybody knowing how to use them, it makes perfect sense today, and everybody does this. But without Willy War, it wouldn't have been done as quickly. And in some respects, some people say, hey, if he didn't think about this, maybe it wouldn't have been done in World War I or World War II. But he was the revolutionary mind to do this and changed the whole German army to do this. And he called it Stoßtruppen, stormtroopers. And these combined arm units were brilliant use of combined arms, and he was at Hartmannsweiler in the Vogesen, and he also influenced a lot of the fighting around Verdun and so on. So, these guys were not only just being drafted or brilliant logistic officers, but these guys were actually really hardcore warriors as well. We had 4 Medal of Honor recipients in World War One fighting the Germans, the Jewish boys. Solomon is one of the most famous ones, where he was kind of like Alvin York, where he took out like 30 Germans in one day with his incredible marksmanship. So, you get to World War II, and of course we have incredible stories of Americans in World War II. One that I like the most, being a Marine, is Tony Stein. Tony Stein, what I think is so remarkable about him is that he and his family in the 30s escaped Austria because of the anti-Semitism. And had they remained there, they all would have died in the Holocaust, obviously. But he comes over to America, starts going to our schools. He's learning how to be a machinist in basically an automotive shop. And he gets drafted, goes to the Marine Corps. And as he's on a base where there's a couple of destroyed airplanes, he tells his sergeant, "Hey, I know how to handle machines, and I was learning how to be a machinist. I think I can take some of those guns out of the airplane, and has such a rapid rate of fire. I think I can take these 30 millimeter machine guns, and I can harness it around my body." He created this neat little harness where he hold it to the side. If any of you have seen Aliens, fame from 1986, they kind of have this contraption in the movie, because we don't have this type of machine gun in the military, but we should, because this guy, he created what's called the Stinger. So he would build it around his body with his harness. He had the machine gun next to him. He had a huge like gunny sack next to him to carry all of the rounds, up to 150 rounds. So anybody who's been in the military, when he's carrying a 30 caliber machine gun that's been modified mechanically to be fired by a hand instead of fired by a trigger on an airplane, and that you're carrying 100 to 150 rounds of 30 caliber bullets, meaning that you're going into battle with like 80 to 90 pounds of gear, and this rapid rate of fire, 400 to 450 rounds per minute. And when they call it, he was just a brilliant man. When they hit Iwo Jima, he realized that this contraption was going to be the best thing to take out a lot of pillboxes. And as any of you have seen Flags of Our Fathers or Letters from Iwo Jima, when we hit that beach, we got slaughtered. We didn't know what hit us. And those pillboxes, there was 5,000 pillboxes on this island that housed 22,000 Japanese. And we were stuck on the beach. One of the guys that got us off the beach was this good Jewish boy from Austria, Tony Stein. And he went back and forth 10 times to re-ammo up and go back into battle. And he took out 5 pillboxes this way. And to maneuver in the black sand, his boots were not helping him. So he took off his boots, so he's barefooted so he can move around quicker. And he took off his helmet so he could see better. This guy was incredibly brave. And there was 27 Medal of Honor recipients from Iwo Jima out of 80,000 men who served on this island. And Tony Stein, our good Jewish American boy, was one of them. Unfortunately, he was killed by enemy fire a week later. But this guy was just heroic. And I always think of Tony Stein that, with Hitler and his warped, medieval, pathetic anti-Semitism, had he been nice to the German Jews and used them in war, he would have had warriors like Tony Stein and all those warriors I was telling you about with Frankel and Leo Beck and Beckman and so on from World War One, and his stupidity of not using these incredible, people, is just one of many things that he was stupid about. But kind of the story of Judaism and Jews is that if you're nice to us and you let us come into your country, we're going to be really good patriots. Just let us have our families, gatherings. Let us have our synagogues. Let us have our rituals and so on. And if you leave us alone, we just want to drink, have a lot of fun, study, and be nice to our communities. So Tony Stein is somebody I'm very proud of. Well, across the ocean in Germany, we have this concept named Blitzkrieg. And the man who developed this was Helmut Wilbur. He had a Jewish mother. He was Aryanized by Hitler, but he was the first guy in World War I, or first guy in military history, that during World War I, he started thinking, man, wouldn't it be great if the artillery units, the infantry units, the tank units, and the airplanes all communicated together. And then we coordinated our attacks against one center of gravity, Schwerpunkt, of the enemy. And he was the first guy ever to use radios and airplanes to communicate with guys on the ground and communicate these forces. He also, with Bruckmüller, developed the rolling barrage, where you would time the artillery to go in front of the guys by about 50 yards. So the guys would start marching off, leaving the trenches, and then every 50 yards you had the artillery going in front of them, and you had the airplanes attacking at the same time. This guy was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And one thing that's interesting, I find, is a lot of the techniques Bruckmüller was depending on was developed by one of the most brilliant artillerists in the history of artillery, named Mino Berg, a Jewish boy from Berlin. And I've been to his grave in the Jewish cemetery there in Berlin. So you look at this culture that was giving birth to these brilliant minds, and Wilberg basically developed Regulation 16, was the whole concept of Blitzkrieg that Germany did until 1942. And the sad thing about him, he was Aryanized by Hitler, quote unquote, and then he lost 9 relatives in the Holocaust, and he died in a plane crash going to Mulder's funeral in May of 1941. So we didn't have the opportunity to ask him, why did you do this, and did you know about the Holocaust, and so on. But he was a German-Prussian patriot. And so you have two of these men, these brilliant Jewish minds, Willy War and Helmut Wilbur, who have influenced military tactics and strategies probably more than any other military people in the world, and most people don't know about them. In fact, Willy War came up with what's called Auftragstaktik, which in other words is called mission statements. And anybody who's been in the military knows that the best thing a leader can do is to give you a goal, but let you figure it out. Instead of telling you how to take over the hill, he just says, take the hill, and you figure it out. And these are called mission statements. And when I was in the Marine Corps, we used that all the time. And I know I'm going a little bit longer, Rabbi, in not opening questions. I'll finish up with just a couple other wonderful Americans, if you don't know about Tibor Reuben from the Korean War, Medal of Honor recipient. This guy was brilliant. He was suffering anti-Semitism from a sergeant that was ahead of him, over him, was really mean to him, and left him behind the lines to die, basically. And Reuben was in this area where the Chinese were coming over in droves. And the Chinese didn't know that this place had been abandoned and that he had been left there to kind of hold up, as a token force, so to speak. But it was a suicide mission that he was sent on. But this Reuben, brilliant guy, he basically set up all these machine gun posts and rifle posts and kind of put up some dead guys. And then he also kind of had like scarecrows. And he would run up and down the line firing at these Chinese guys. And they thought they were actually attacking a whole company. And this one guy is running around doing all this firing here, firing there. Brilliant. And he survives. And so if you don't know about Reuben, he died in 2015. You got to look up this incredible American Jewish hero. Also, right close to his lines, there was another guy doing the same thing, but had a good unit protecting him. He loved his boys. His name was Leonard Kravitz, and he died protecting their retreat. And he knew what was coming. And many of you will know his famous nephew, who's named after him, Lenny Kravitz, the rock star. And so I could go on and on talking about our great martial heritage, our American heroes, Jewish background, our contribution militarily to military history and tactics. But the rabbi told me to talk for 20 minutes, and I've talked now for 40. So I'll open it up for some questions. And thank you so much for joining us today and listening to me.
Thank you, Brian. To everyone, this is Joel. I've been asked to host the Q&A part of the program. I've switched this back to gallery view so I can see everyone. What we'll do is what I've been doing during other programs is I will alternate between the written chat and people raising their hands. So I've got a couple of things in chat. Brian, you may see them. Elliot Korn mentioned that it's not a question, but that his first cousin Norton Schwartz served as Air Force Chief of Staff between 2008 and 2012. And that actually leads me to a question from Susan Horwitz. Is there a glass ceiling in terms of Jewish leadership at the top of levels of U.S. military?
Well, there was. I mean, it was much more difficult during the Civil War. The numbers are a little bit hard to come by, but it looks like there was around 9,000 Union soldiers of Jewish descent, and there was 3,000 Confederate soldiers of Jewish descent. In fact, many of you will know the Secretary of War for the Confederacy was Benjamin. So it's kind of sad with our huge tradition of escaping slavery from Egypt and how horrible it is, and yet we're supporting some of these horrible institutions in America. But yeah, early on we had a hard time. But I think especially after World War II, and in World War II there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Not obviously not nearly as grotesque as we saw in Europe. But after World War II, when you bring 16.3 million men and women together and are forcing them to work together and so on, a lot of American boys at the time realized we don't have horns. We're just like everybody else, American Pie, jazz, and whatnot. And that really pushed us into the next level. Now I don't see any problems in America probably for the last the last 3 or 4 decades. The opportunities in the military for anybody, regardless of what ethnicity they are or religion, is not an issue for them to rise up to high ranks.
Right.
And what I like to point out, Sidney Sanchow, wonderful guy. He was a Holocaust survivor. And then he rises up to command our special forces, and was a man who advised President Clinton. And that guy was an incredible warrior, incredibly influential in developing our special forces command. And that's the story of America. Holocaust survivor, and then he rises up to commanding our special forces in America.
Sure. I'll ask for some hands raised, but I just want to say one quick thing. One quick thing is that I know a lot of people realize that over 500,000 American Jews served in the U.S. Armed Forces in World War II, including both of my parents, which is where they met. And I asked my father, some funny stories about that, but we won't get into that. I asked my father if he ever experienced anti-Semitism, and he told me he hadn't. And then I asked him, because he came from an Orthodox Jewish background, how did you handle food? He said, well, when they served pork, I just ate the vegetables. But other than that, just dealt with it. Do I see any hands raised? Anybody? Anybody for a question?
Well, hey, if not, the one I want to bring up, you speak World War II. One of my dear friends who was the fleet medical officer in the Atlantic, Lee Mandel, he was a captain. He wrote a book about Rabbi Gittleson, from World War II. And if you haven't ever read Gitelson's The Purest Democracy, he gave basically the eulogy at the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima. He was a pacifist. He was a brilliant mind, but he's a pacifist. He was a reform rabbi. And in the 30s, as he's seeing Mussolini and Hitler doing all their horrible stuff, he's like, you know what? If we don't stand up to this stuff, they're going to just roll over us. And so pacifism is really not the way to go. So he actually joins the Navy as a chaplain. And here's this pacifist rabbi that is sent to all places, one of the most horrific battlefields of World War II, Iwo Jima. And he was with the guys all 36 days in the trenches, you know, doing last rites, doing the Shema. I mean, the guy was incredibly brave, a wonderful mind. And it's an interesting story, speaking of anti-Semitism. His commander was a Baptist minister, and he realized that out of all the chaplains, the priests and so on that were of this division command, Gitelson was the best speaker. So he said, I want you to do the eulogy for the 5th Marine Division. Well, a whole bunch of priests, because we hadn't had Vatican II yet, you know, we're Christ killers and, you know, and we're going to hell and so on. And they were really, the Catholic priests were pretty pathetic in this area. They protested. Like, we don't want this guy. Most of these guys are, you know, doing the eulogy. Most of these people who are dead are Christian boys. This is blasphemy to have a rabbi. And they really pushed this, the head of the chaplaincy at this time, to remove Gitelson. Well, Gitelson, when he learned about this, he went to his commander and said, hey, you know, let's just split it up into 3 services. Let's have the best Protestant, you know, speaker, chaplain, give the Protestant a eulogy. Let's have the Catholic priest and let them go, you know, thinking that they're the only ones going to heaven, you know, do their thing. And then I'll do it for the Jews. There was a couple of Protestant ministers that were so disgusted by these priests and their behavior, and also by some of the Protestant chaplains, that they boycotted the other 2 services, and they went to Rabbi Gitelson's. And they were so blown away by Rabbi Gitelson's eloquent delivery speech and the message that was given. It's called the Gettysburg Address of World War II. That they took a copy of it and they went to the facsimile machines on the beach and they started making copies by the thousands. And as the guys were leaving the island, they started giving it to the guys to read as they went back to their troop ships to go back to Saipan, Hawaii, and Guam, and other places where they had departed from. So many of these young boys read this and they were so moved by it that they started sending it back to their parents. And the parents in turn started giving this to journalists in America. And before you knew it, Gitelson became famous. And so here's the irony of ironies. While these Catholic pathetic priests, anti-Semites, were trying to shut up Gitelson, by doing that act, they actually inadvertently made him one of the most famous chaplains in the history of the United States military. And President Truman was so taken with Gitelson that Gitelson was the first person ever by a president to be assigned to Interfaith Council, and was just a brilliant mind. So, you know, one of our great Jewish heroes from the military campaigns that we've had is Rabbi Roland Gitelson. And if you guys don't know about him, hopefully that's the one guy you take away from this talk, that you'll look him up, read The Purest Democracy. When I read it, it brings tears to my eyes. And it also, what he did and how he wrote is very germane to what's going on in America today. As he's talking about, hey, we're part of one race, the human race, and we're Americans, and we need to support each other and support democracy. And having politically, different opinions politically is what makes this democracy rich and good. It's a brilliant, brilliant talk. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of Gitelson. Had I known about Gitelson when my sons were born, probably Gitelson would be in their name somewhere.
Right. One of our members, Ted Probst, who is himself a proud Navy veteran, writes that His dad, who served in, well, he writes World War One, was a patient with the flu pandemic, and his hospital discharge listed him as Protestant. So the family thinks he may have hid his Jewish background because of anti-Semitism at the time.
Well, there's two reasons why a lot of Jewish boys that you'll find in your family in the closet that their dog tags have Protestant or Catholic. They didn't know where they were going to be deployed, and we knew about anti-Semitism and Hitler's persecution. We didn't know in particular all about the death camps and so on, but we knew that we didn't want to be taken prisoner by the Nazis. But if you were taken prisoner by the Nazis, you wanted to do your utmost to make sure you didn't have Hebrew or Israelites or Jewish on your dog tag. So that's some of the reason why. And I'm sure there were some other guys that went into the service saying, hey, I just want to be one of the guys, and the best way to do that is be part of the dominant culture. Like Heinrich Heine in Germany said when he converted, I just got my passport to Western civilization.
Rabbi Weinsberg writes, and then I'm going to come back to you, Ted. Rabbi Weinsberg writes, asks if you can talk more about the World War II boats and other technical material built by Jews.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, this is one thing that a lot of people don't know, which I write about on my author's page, anybody that's interested, about Victor Krulak. Victor Krulak, and then his son, Charles Krulak, was our 31st Commandant of the Marine Corps. Now, Victor Krulak came over in the teens and 20s because of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. His parents were sick and tired of the Russian anti-Semitism. And quite frankly, if you had asked me in 1935, where would a Holocaust happen? I would say in France or Poland or Russia, never Germany. Russian anti-Semitism is just horrible. So they left, came to America. Victor Krulak grew up in America, of Jewish descent, had a bar mitzvah. But when he went to the Naval Academy at the age of 16, at the great height of 5'2", he converted, or he started telling people he's Protestant, because there was anti-Semitism at the Naval Academy at that time. So he goes to the Naval Academy. He grows 2 more inches to the great height of 5'4", and that's why he got the nickname Brute, because he's one of the smallest guys in his unit. But he was a brilliant mind, and he was set into an intelligence group that went over to China and observed a lot of the Japanese attacks on Chinese areas around Shanghai in particular. And he saw these special ramp boats that the Japanese were using that had a front ramp that would go down in the front of the boat. They'd hit a beach, and the guys would run out of the front of the ship instead of going over the side. So he came back, and he was good friends, I'd say he had a good working relationship with General Howland Mad Smith, who was in charge of amphibious operations. And he worked with Howland Mad Smith, who was good friends with Andrew Higgins, the Higgins boat. We made 25,000 of them, and they developed this Higgins boat to such a way that this is what brought all our guys. You see it in Saving Private Ryan. You go up on the beach, drop that, and without these boats, as General Dwight D. Eisenhower said, without these boats, we could not have done our operations, and we could not have won World War II the way we did. It would have taken us years more to do what we did without these boats. And there's this just Jewish kid from the Naval Academy that was one of the prime movers for this. And the sad thing that happened is while he's doing this, his grandparents are killed in the Holocaust. But without this guy, you don't have the invasion of Normandy in many respects. And so it's kind of the twist of fate of this Victor Krulak that we need to know more about. Brute Krulak. And he's another American Jewish hero of mine, and a Marine. So, I'm partial to him.
Yes. We're about to wrap up, but I'm going to go to Ted. You had your hand up for a question.
No, it wasn't really a question. I just wanted to clarify. I did mean World War I. My dad was a sergeant major in World War I, and the flu pandemic was 1918, a little over 100 years ago. That's what I was talking about. He apparently had caught the flu like a lot of other people obviously did. And I'm here, so as you know, he survived it. But it did say that on his hospital papers, it does say he's Protestant.
Well, yeah, back then I would agree with you. Probably in the teens and 20s, you had a lot of anti-Semitism still there. I mean, good God, I grew up in America in the 70s and 80s, and at the churches that I attended, I was taught that the reason why the Jews have so many problems in life with the Holocaust and all the other stuff is because they rejected Jesus. Here in good old America, you have this ancient, primitive, Catholic, if you will, anti-Semitism that was being preached to me. Now, I think we're getting better and better and more away from that, especially with the Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, when from 1962 to 65, the Catholic Church finally, after 2,000 years, gets it right and says the Jews aren't guilty for God's killing, if you will, Jesus being hung on a cross, and that they're our sister religion and we need to treat them with respect. So yeah, Ted, you're right. I think your dad probably, that's why he did do that, to protect himself. And hey, thanks for your service. If you can't get in the Marine Corps, Navy's a good safety service to go into.
I was with the 2nd Marine Division.
Ah, there we go.
You may be aware that the Navy doctors take care of the Marine Corps.
Yeah, just like Lee
I made
Mandel, my
plenty
good
of
friend.
landings on those Higgins boats.
Yeah, well, our corpsmen, we love our corpsmen, we love our docs, our doctors, and our nurses, and they're all Navy. So thank you, Doc, for your service.
I'm going to call on Michael Krasnow for our last question. But just before I do, Michael, hold on one second. You brought up Vatican II. A very short story. Growing up in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is a very multi-ethnic place, and all my playmates were every color, every religion. Most of them were Irish Catholic, and they went to St. Bridget's Church around the corner. And one Sunday, one of the kids coming back from church said to me while we were playing, "The priest just told us in church that I'm supposed to hate the Jews because you killed Christ." Then we took a beat, and I'll mean a physical beat. We took a beat, and we went back to playing because they didn't care. And then Vatican II happened. But it's just illustrative of those days. Michael Krasnow, you had a question. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, more of a comment. Bryan, you're talking about there's no anti-Semitism now in the military. There may not be an official anti-Semitism, but the troops and the sailors, etc., still are very anti-Semitic. They were when I was in the 50s. And when I got my dog tags, they refused to put Jewish on it. They put Hebrew. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, and I think there probably is more now than there was then.
Well, I hope you're wrong. I think you're right from your experience in the 50s. I think there was a huge watershed moment with the Vatican II, and then also with this huge wave of evangelical ministers, especially with Billy Graham and others, and Hagee down in San Antonio, with this love of Israel. It's kind of a weird thing, this love that we have from the evangelicals. Because on one side they look at us as the remnant of the land, that when Armageddon happens, we're going to be slaughtered, and that's why they like us to be around. So Jesus, when he comes back, he can have the end times and whatnot. I love the story of I think Menachem Begin came over here, and he was courting these evangelicals, Jimmy Baker, Jim Swaggart, Billy Graham at the time, and he came back to Israel, and a lot of the rabbis were furious with him, going, "Don't you know who you're dealing with? These Christians don't really care about us. They just look at us as kind of like pets, for their theology, and they just kind of like to have, being cozy up to us, but they don't really care about us. And why are you doing this?" He's like, "Well, we don't have a lot of friends to begin with in the world. We got to have everybody we can." And they kept on hammering him about, this Christian bigotry, that they look down upon us. They look down that we're going to hell. And this does create a racism, indeed. But Menachem Begin looked at all these, ultra-Orthodox rabbis that were hammering. He's like, "I got a simple way to solve this, guys. When the Messiah comes, we'll just simply ask him, 'Have you been here before?' And he'll answer. Until then, I'm going to deal with the Christians." So, you're right to bring up, I think there is some inherent anti-Semitism in a lot of the Christian churches, and they don't even realize it's there, like what I was taught. But as far as the overt anti-Semitism, that is going to prevent you from being promoted. It's going to prevent you from marrying who you want to marry. It's going to prevent you legally of obtaining flag rank or whatnot. I don't think, from my experience, I don't see it. In fact, I saw more racism, if you will, in the Israeli military than I ever saw as a Marine Corps officer. But in the 50s, America, in your experience, Carl, it's Carl, right?
Michael.
Oh, it's Michael. It's Michael. Okay. Oh yeah, I see Carl. Oh no. Okay. Now
It's Carol and Michael.
Yeah, Michael. Yeah. So yeah, I agree. In the time that you're in, I'm sorry. You're right. You probably had a hard time. Now I just don't see it. I mean, Ted, did you see a lot of it?
I did not personally see a lot of it. In fact, I could pretty much say I didn't see any of it. We had an Episcopalian Marine Corps chaplain who went out of his way to help us celebrate Rosh Hashanah. This you'll crack up laughing, but a bunch of loudmouth Jewish doctors got together at Camp Lejeune and went to the commander of the base and said, we have 30 chaplains, but we don't have a rabbi. We want a rabbi. And so the commanding general for Camp Lejeune wrote to the commandant of the Marine Corps and requested a rabbi. And we had a Marine Corps rabbi chaplain come down to tell us about how Jews don't require a rabbi to pray. 9 rabbis doesn't make a minyan, and all those other usual quotes you've heard. And what happened was, a few months after that, a rabbi was assigned. And I would tell you that Rabbi Apple was probably more Marine than he was Jewish. But, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
but he was. We got a rabbi requested by the commanding general of the base, and as the commandant said, he'd never heard of a commanding general requesting a rabbi be assigned.
Oh, that's great. Well, when I love you bring up a story that happened to me that I think is really great. So I'm at OCS, Officer Candidate School. And every night you line up in the barracks and you say God, country, corps, and you put your hands together, a foot out, and your head down. And then there was always a Catholic prayer, and then a Protestant prayer, and then you got in your rack. Well, after being there for a few weeks, I met a good buddy of mine named Levine. I met another guy by the name of Schweitzer, and then there was Rigg. But I was the only one that knew the Shema because I'd been to yeshiva in Israel. So I went to our commander, Captain Erickson, and I said, hey, we have this Protestant prayer and Catholic prayer every night. There's 30 of us in this platoon, and 10% of us, are Jewish. You got 3 guys that are Jewish. Can I do the Shema? And he's like, absolutely. So then for the rest of the 7 weeks that we were there at OCS, every night after the Catholic prayer and the Protestant prayer, I belted out my best Shema to make my Orthodox rabbis proud. And, people were just fascinated by it. They didn't care. There was a great support. There was one guy that wanted to convert me. He was worried about my mortal soul. But then when I started telling him about, what the Jews really think about a Messiah and how Jesus doesn't really match it, I kind of think I confused him more than anything. So, but we were able to have that debate, So, yeah, I'm glad, Ted, you had that experience. And Michael, I'm sorry you had the experience you did. But you led the way for Ted and I to have a better experience. So thank you for your service.
I'm going to turn this over to either Rabbi Ed or Al Tridell to wrap it up. I know we're almost out of time, but just to dovetail onto what you just said, I mentioned my parents met in the Army in World War II, and my mother was a WAC. And every Friday night they would turn the base. This is down in Mississippi, by the way, during World War II, so you can imagine the climate there. They would turn the base chapel over to the Jews to have their Friday night service, and my mother would lead the would recite the the blessing over the candles and lead that. And she even made the papers for doing that. So, you know, I'm sure there was anti-Semitism within the military, but also they made sure that people were accommodated. Either Al or Rabbi Ed?
Hey, listen, Bryan, thank you so much for such a dynamic and comprehensive historical view of Jews in battle. It's just so fascinating. But I also want to thank you for making this such an interactive experience for us, not only those who are in the men's club, but others who are participating this morning. So thank you all for being here. And Bryan, above all, let's stay in touch.
Hey, thank you so much, Rabbi. Thanks, everybody. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
Bryan.
Stay healthy. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom. Thank
Shalom.
you, Brian. That was fascinating.
You're
Hey,
welcome.
thank you, sir. Appreciate
Take
it.
care, one and all.